Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Two of the biggest myths when it comes to working with people with disabilities is the belief that technology and employee accessibility is expensive. The second is the belief that employees with disabilities hurt, not help drive business revenue. These myths are conversations we need to talk about, and I want to work to debunk these, which is why I'm excited to talk to my podcast guest today. This episode is part of the Workology Podcast, and it's part of our Future of Work series, which is powered by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. In honor of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act this year, we're investigating what the next 30 years will look like for people with disabilities at work, and the potential of emerging technologies to make workplaces more inclusive and accessible. Today, I'm joined by Mike Hess. Mike Hess is the founder and executive director of the Blind Institute of Technology. After 20 years as a tech veteran managing seven-figure projects for Fortune 500 companies, one thing troubled Mike. He was always the token blind guy. Knowing that the invaluable skills he developed because of his blindness were the keys to his success, he couldn't understand why unemployment amongst the BVI community was so high. So Mike embarked on a journey to change corporate America's stigmas and misconceptions of BVI professionals, developing the Blind Institute of Technology. Using the same skills that made him a success in IT, Mike has built partnerships and placed BVI professionals in Fortune 500 companies nationwide. Mike has been featured in the Denver Post and the Denver Business Journal and has been honored with the 2017 Martin Luther King Jr. Business Award and the 2019 Global Mind Ed Inclusive Leader Award. BIT's focus on accessible technology has garnered invitations to present at Google Cloud's next 2019 conference and Salesforce's Dreamforce in 2019. Mike is also the co-host for Choose Inclusion, a podcast addressing the benefits of diversity and inclusion. In 2019, Mike's vision of full access for BVI led him to develop Edge Guide, a navigation system that allows independent navigation in previously inaccessible public spaces. Mike, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor.
My mind is blown with all these things and the work that you're doing. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Sure. It sounds kind of impressive. Like we're busy actually doing something. It's never just a single, as you know this, running a business or anybody else running a business or managing a team. Like it's a team effort, and I'm so fortunate to work with such an amazing team. However, my background, I started out way back in the mid '90s as a coder. And moved on. I was almost all my career was telecommunications, and so I went from coding for the billing system to being a network engineer. So the translations that allowed the phone calls to traverse the network. And in telecommunications, if you can bill for it and you can route it, it's a product. And so as I was continuing on with my career, able to manage larger and larger projects, and I didn't really want to get into management, but I was curious on the kind of the art or the science of building a business case, working on technology projects that sometimes, quite honestly, after, a dozen or so years of experience, I was really baffled of business decisions that were being made. And so I started raising my hand for skip level type opportunities with the C-suite within organizations, and kind of really picking their brain around this concept of building a business case, because I wanted to figure this out. I was kind of perplexed, and then so I started dabbling in the ability to not only run a company from that C-suite perspective, but also just recognize how to communicate effectively with a C-suite type team. And so And then as my career progressed, I started realizing like I really was frustrated with being that token blind person. And as an engineer, started doing some due diligence and just recognized there are some great organizations and entities that are out there that advocate for blind, visually impaired, and the greater people with disabilities community. And somewhere on their websites, they talk about employment services. And so I kind of, after talking to my wife, and my wife being such a supporter of this concept that I came up with called Blind Institute of Technology, where it's an entity that's solely focused on employment for people with disabilities. I left my six-figure income with a small child at home to start this dream 7.5 years ago. So it was a collaborative decision to do so. And it's like all startups, even though we're a nonprofit, we faced a lot of startup challenges, just like a lot of other organizations do. And but 7.5 years later, we're here adding value to organizations nationwide.
Well, let's talk a little bit about accessibility, especially since so much of our life has recently shifted to telework and remote work. Can you talk to us about what digital accessibility looks like for workplaces?
Absolutely. So as we were kind of talking a little bit before we came on air, this pandemic environment is quite honestly is easier for kind of the people with disabilities community from just a logistics perspective. When you think of how challenging mass transit, or in my case, flying from city to city, talking to different organizations, and navigating, where to find the Uber stations and all of those kind of environments, doing just utilizing unified communications, whether it be, Microsoft Teams or Zoom or any, Google Hangouts. Like these unified communications are A, incredibly accessible, and B, just super convenient for people with disabilities who have just a couple of other challenges to consider when having to travel so much. So I actually, and I say that with truly the understanding that the pandemic has permanently affected so many organizations and so many people's lives. I don't say that, with a smile on my face. However, always looking for that silver lining, specifically for me, and then others within the professionals with disabilities community, just recognizing that it really, this pandemic environment has made doing business just a wee bit easier.
Your work and your expertise in this area speaks volumes. And I wanted to ask you about, how do you work with employers when you offer accessibility technology solutions? Is there a best practice, or how do you go about that? What's the process?
Well, so it's a great question. And so we lead with, and I'm sure you've had so many guests on the show. PEAT Works absolutely talks about, accessible technology. So accessible technology foundationally and fundamentally comes from WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessible Guidelines, which of course is adhered to by Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So like there's all of those the best practices and the principles all come from, tried and true requirements. So we as an organization, because again, I said that we, Blind Institute of Technology, focuses really on the employment epidemic, the unemployment epidemic for people with disabilities. And as I talk to organizations and partner with, juggernauts like Salesforce or CVS nationwide, how I pitch people with disabilities to these organizations is that it is a technology solution. So in other words, whether you're blind, whether you're deaf, whether you're on the spectrum, whether you have an anxiety disorder, there are technologies in place to help individuals with disabilities to be able to overcome those challenges and be able to perform and produce for that organization. And so it's not that we are, there are so many A11Y organizations that are out there, and we help several very large clients nationwide with their A11Y. However, our jam, our bailiwick is not just selling Oh, well, here's how you make this environment accessible. So too many, quite honestly, that market is saturated. So our way into organizations is helping them with their diversity, equity, and inclusion hiring practices in and around people with disabilities. So because we speak that language first, our organization, we are experts in workforce development, and that's the language we speak for these organizations. And that's why we're creating partnerships nationwide.
One of the other reasons that I wanted to talk to you about this topic of accessible technology is on the subject of productivity. Unfortunately, there are a lot of stereotypes and opinions that tie productivity challenges to people with disabilities because they do or do not need accommodation. Can you talk to me a little bit about your work in this area and why this is personally important to you?
Sure. Again, another good question. I honestly, there is a lot of anecdotal stuff out there, and there are some horror stories. I get that. So if you dig around and poke around the internet long enough, or if you just start asking around, like everybody knows somebody that had some kind of a situation. So all I can do is explain, what we as an organization, Blind Institute of Technology, we personally as an organization, or we as an organization have a 96.7% retention rate with the individuals that we place within companies. So in other words, companies spend a lot more money on attrition based on the talent that we find them. So kind of a bonus. So they're not just keeping these folks on board because they're unable to produce. So it's starting with that. So our own, this is our data, our organizational data. Then if we move on to the most recent Accenture report, where they talk about organizations that embrace people with disabilities from an employment perspective have a 28% higher revenue, a 30% higher profit margin, and 2 times net income higher than their industry peers. So when you start thinking of that as a data set, okay, those are just numbers, right? That absolutely you could easily connect the dots or make the argument that these organizations are obviously finding some kind of value, some kind of productivity with these teammates that maybe other organizations who haven't found out what I consider the greatest untapped resource in the world, which is the professionals with disabilities community, have not.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology Podcast. Today, we are talking with Mike Hess about workplace accessibility. This podcast is sponsored by Workology and is part of our Future of Work series in partnership with PEAT. They're the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology.
The Workology Podcast Future of Work series is supported by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. PEAT's initiative is to foster collaboration and action around accessible technology in the workplace. PEAT is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP. Learn more about PEAT at peatworks.org. That's PEATWORKS.org.
One of the things that HR leaders are pretty familiar with is accommodation requests. And I wondered if you could maybe provide me with, I know you mentioned the Accenture report, but possibly another example of how accessibility and accommodation requests drive performance, especially with the work that you're doing and the people that you're bringing into these organizations.
Sure. Well, when we talk to organizations, we when the conversations are very, very unique depending on the leader within the organizations. And so when we're talking to HR leaders, reasonable accommodations is a topic. And I submit that the same coin, just flip side of the coin of reasonable accommodation, is the term accessible technology. And when we're able to prove that there are organizations such as Microsoft, such as Google, such as Salesforce, a very key strategic partner for BIT, that have completely committed to making their technology completely accessible. So I start, process of elimination at this point in time when I'm talking to these organizations, like, Okay, are you a Microsoft shop? Well, of course. Okay, do you have some Google infrastructure? Yeah, probably. Are you a Salesforce shop? They're the largest CRM in the world, so there's a really good chance that some part of the organization, or in many cases, the entire organization, has some kind of enterprise-wide Salesforce solution. So when I start talking to them about technologies that these organizations currently have in place, I let them know that, many times the work has already been done for that coin of reasonable accommodation. So from a digital perspective, many times that business case has already been made. So on the flip side of that, when I start talking to, let's say, technology leaders, right? And literally I've been asked by COOs and CIOs and CTOs of organizations who are super bright people, super bright individuals. And they're like, Mike, give me a solid example. Like I've been in technology a long time. I don't explain what accessible technology is. And I'm like, okay, a simple example. I said, for a user interface, I said, to be able to navigate a user interface without using a mouse, right? I said, it's super, you're focused on tab control, you're focused on your DOM. And I asked these technology leaders, what kind of a lift is it to make those user interfaces, implement that tab control? And they're like, oh, it's a low level of effort. And I'm like, exactly. So from a zeros and ones perspective, like making technology, and when you start taking away the mouse and you're doing keyboard control, all of a sudden now that's not just the blind visually impaired community, right? It's the motor skills impaired community. It's so many, for power users, that is absolutely a key driver for power users' productivity, is making sure that user interfaces are strictly navigable based on the keyboard. And so those are the kind of conversations. And then let's flip over to, let's say I'm talking to somebody from a contact center perspective, a tier one, or a sales organizations. When I'm selling the people with disabilities, when I'm selling, let's say, blind visually impaired people from an assets perspective, because again, I always lead with, we add value, we as an organization or as a community add value to your organization's bottom line and your culture. And per the Accenture report, we actually have some hard data that proves that point. However, when I'm talking to these, different parts of the organization, I explain to them, if you can come up with another demographic who has the patent on active listening other than the blind visually impaired, I'd like to know who they are. So again, I'm always focused on the assets, how it is that we add value to organizations.
Businesses are focused on ROI, or return on investment. Can you talk about how accessibility contributes to an organization's success, financial and otherwise?
Sure. It's an estimated $645 billion of disposable income from the people with disabilities community in the United States alone. Estimated $645 billion. And so when you look at it just from that spending power for businesses who are reluctant to, let's say, not jump, and based on all the, very public lawsuits, right? From Harbor to Domino's to Nike to Five Guys. There's the Winn-Dixie. These are really public national brands, international brands, very recent, 2019. These are all really recent lawsuits that have taken, their turn in the spotlight, which isn't always a good spotlight. And when you think of organizations who have not jumped on the bandwagon of accessibility, they're missing out on a market share. The people with disabilities, the reason why, let's say from a technology, just a mobile device perspective, when Steve Jobs, in my opinion, one of the more brilliant things that he did early on, with a very early onset of the iPhone, iDevices, he ensured that all those devices had accessibility baked in. And still to this day, when you go to, let's say, a blindness convention or conference, and yes, believe it or not, there are many of those. I call them, cane and dog conferences, because there's a whole lot of those there. They're practically an iPhone conference, because early on, that technology company, and it used to be, I haven't looked recently, but it used to be the fourth value on the Apple website was accessibility. And so when organizations tap into that purchasing power, there's a very loyal demographic that absolutely will keep coming back, because we do not, unfortunately, have as many options as our fully able-bodied peers.
You know, working with PEAT and my time spent on this Future of Work podcast has really opened my eyes to this area, because I think I take for granted things like ramps or electric doors or simple things on the iPhone that make my life so much easier, that I love, like Siri, for example, and different features, but they were first built for people with disabilities to be able to use different technologies. That is truly universal design, but the purpose was to make this technology accessible for everyone, including people with disabilities.
100%.
Sometimes we forget the why behind why something like Apple, which is so very simple, and I'm a huge Apple fan, was developed, and how it came about. The simple design, easy to use, it's really accessible for everyone. What have you found are the best approaches to broach subjects like this to senior leadership? I find that HR leaders generally have big hearts, but unfortunately, sometimes translating the need to provide support and resources to marginalized groups in the workplace, like people with disabilities, often gets lost in translation. What suggestions do you have?
I love this question, and quite honestly, I feel like it's what delineates Blind Institute of Technology with any other organization that's out there right now. And I've met with so many of the senior leaders of the blindness organizations or the greater people with disabilities communications. Quite honestly, it's rare to find a leader within any of those organizations, quite honestly, who is somebody with a disability. Or if you do find one that's with a disability, they have zero experience within corporate America. So they don't even speak Fortune 10,000 speak. And so the reason why I was very, very specific on saying that during my corporate career, I spent a lot of time with the C-suite, because it actually is what delineates us at Blind Institute of Technology. I'm able to speak, business case and cost benefit analysis and actually talking about the value proposition that people with disabilities bring. This shouldn't be a philanthropic endeavor. This should absolutely be something that organizations buy into and start realizing, like, oh yeah. So again, let's forget about all the Accenture numbers, which are pretty impressive numbers, right? Let's start focusing on that people with disabilities are less likely to leave their jobs, because again, when you think about it, we're not going to job hop. We don't get jobs to begin with. We don't have the same opportunities as our fully able-bodied peers. We recognize that. And again, from a business perspective, there's cost to attrition. So every one of the data points that we come to the organization with, it's all about adding value to their organizations and recognizing that reasonable accommodations really are reasonable. And more than likely, you already probably have several of them baked in, you just didn't know about. And so senior leaders, and not all of them, it's no different than call it the Black Lives Matter movement or whatnot. There are a lot of organizations who talk a big game when it comes to, oh yeah, we're totally inclusive, we're totally this, we're totally. So you can go back to their hiring practices. Where are you recruiting from? If you continue just to recruit from the elite schools and and who is attending those elite schools, you cannot tell me, and yeah, thank you for writing the great big old check over to, BLM or some other organization. However, it's within the people with disabilities community, in these other marginalized communities, quite honestly, the word gets out there which organizations are truly walking the walk or not.
Well, I love the consultative approach that you're taking, and I love that you're speaking the language of executive leaders, because I feel like you hit the nail on the head saying a lot of it is lost in translation, or they don't understand the business itself to be able to use the words and talk about the return on investment in a way that is going to resonate with executive leadership. Can you share about how your consultative approach has helped you at achieving success and supporting organizations in the way that you have?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So BIT, so Blind Institute of Technology, and just again, this is the kind of nerd I am, is that I I took the binary bit, the 0 and 1, right, machine language, and created the acronym Blind Institute of Technology. So that's my claim to marketing fame. However, I truly believe that technology is the greatest mitigator for all of humanity. From the Wright brothers to the pencil, always helping humanity overcome its obstacles. And in the digital age, it's absolutely essential for our quality of life, let alone our ability to earn our own nickel. So when I think of our success in getting people placed, when I, again, because of my approach of leading with technology as that reasonable accommodation that you probably already have in place, when I come to these organizations, there are still some risks and some objections to these organizations. So we as an organization have so we're a nonprofit staffing agency. So so organizations just like, the big staffing agencies like a Robert Half or something like that, they, if you go to them and you're like, oh man, find us a, Java developer, right? And fine. Okay. So what's your placement fee? So their placement fee is, somewhere north of 25%. I think it's north of 30%. But so for the first year annual salary, they'll take 30% for you to find that individual. So we as a nonprofit aren't even close to that. We charge 12% for our direct placements to these organizations. And we found senior directors, we found vice presidents, we found very high level. We have multiple very high 1,000s, 100,000s, salaries that we've helped do retainer searches for and finding talent, which all of them have stuck. We've also found some contact centers, but at the end of the day, the best model that we've found, organizations who want to dip their toe in the pond of professionals with disabilities, is we do a contract to hire model, which is very common in the staffing industry. So we keep those individuals on our books, and we offer benefits and paid time off, and we do not charge back our clients because, again, we want to be an employer of choice as well. But we want to remove any risk that organizations might have or any objections. So we've created the models that work really well with our industry partners.
Talk to me about how technology is essential. I think that sometimes people, including myself, are focused on accommodations like wide doors, screen readers, ramps, and other physical accommodations. However, the rules have changed. We're all mostly working remote. So talk to me about what's essential right now.
Sure. No, and here's the beautiful thing. Like you have so many from Amazon and Apple and Microsoft, Salesforce. Like you have all these Google, you have all these juggernaut technology companies who have completely adopted some type of cloud type environment, right? And so the tools within these cloud environments, quite honestly, so you sent me over some questions using a Google Doc. And so I literally just, I clicked on the link. I listened to it, right there on my phone. I was able to consume and digest that information right at my fingertips, right? Sounds just like any other user of technology. So that's the beautiful thing. And so running an organization, right? So even though we're a nonprofit, I have a board of directors who are completely focused on it's great, Mike, you got a handful of placements. Let's get some more. Let's look at your pipeline. Well, guess what? On the dashboard with my very accessible, Salesforce dashboard, I am able to take a look and say, okay, what opportunities, what are our highest revenue opportunities? What's in the queue right now? How can we move it along in the sales process? Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's all right there at my fingertips, just like any other executive. So when you think about, from regardless of where you are, and we as an organization, so again, it's like a Rogaine commercial. I'm not only the president, I'm a customer too, right? So I have an organization where we have 6 teammates, all identifying with disabilities. Multiple of us are totally blind. And yet we do exactly what any other organization, a staffing agency would do. So we have a statement of work generator that's 100% accessible. We have an applicant tracking system that's 100% accessible. We've created this environment. By the way, it's the reason why we were invited to speak at Google Next last year and at Dreamforce for Salesforce's conference, and because we use our primary infrastructure that we built all this completely accessible technology on is the G Suite, the Google Productivity Suite, the G Suite, and Salesforce. So we've literally built in-house a completely accessible infrastructure. So that way, again, we, as the team scales, we're focused on scaling with individuals that meet our talent needs. So technology is absolutely the game changer. And by the way, like this is out of the box accessible. Out of the box. This isn't like we didn't do some plug-in that cost $1 million. This is out of the box. So when that's why we were invited to speak at those two prestigious conferences, because we're not just talking accessibility. So our conference, our title at the Google Next conference was actually empowering entrepreneurship and employment using Google productivity and accessibility. So it was empowering. Again, I go back to that, empowering entrepreneurship and employment by just leveraging the technology that's out of the box. So the technology is truly what levels the playing field for our community.
I love it. And it's such a great example of, like you said, out of the box. There wasn't anything additional that you had to buy, any new technology that you had to develop. It was all already there for you. As we look to the next 30 years of work, what emerging workplace trends or technologies do you think will have the biggest impact on people with disabilities?
You know, it's a great question. I truly believe that actually I believe it's more than a fad this time with the Black Lives Matter. I truly believe, and we as an organization, we pitch us as a diversity and inclusion solutions provider for professionals with disabilities. That's how we pitch our organization and our services to organizations. And with the Black Lives Matter, really, it's so refreshing to hear, the momentum continue to move on with that. We're just leveraging, saying, okay, hey, while your organization is focused on, inclusion, we're just asking you to be inclusive with your inclusion conversations. So in other words, as organizations truly, the ones who are walking the talk, right? Those organizations who are truly doing that, all we want to do is we want to be included in those conversations. So as you are really looking at your recruiting practices, as you're looking at your hiring practices, all that, the time is now. Like do the, adding the professionals with disabilities community to those efforts is seamless. And it absolutely fits fine. So we're not asking you to ignore, right, the very important racial injustices and the institutional disparities that absolutely exist. So we want you to also recognize, while those institutional inequities have been in place for marginalized groups, the BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous, people of color community, they are also in place for the greater people with disabilities community. So I truly believe that it's not the next 30 years. I believe it's going to be the next 36 months.
I love this. And I'm going to repeat what you said. You ask to be inclusive with your inclusive conversations. Sounds simple, but it is very complicated. But the time is now. Why we're starting to have those conversations, to include everyone that should and must be included in hiring, engagement, and employment.
100%.
I love it. I love it. And I love how simple it is. It sounds, but while you're already having these conversations, let's think about truly being inclusive and involving, employing, and hiring everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I wanted to ask you where we can go to learn more about you and the work that you do.
Sure. Thank you. We're pretty easy to find. It's blindinstituteoftechnology.org, or we also have the domain blindit.org. So blind as in unable to see, blindit.org. So we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. We'd love to talk to any organization who is wanting to have some of those amazing financial and cultural results that are absolutely documented now.
Awesome. Well, we will link to your website as well as your LinkedIn profile. I also will make sure to include a lot of the amazing reporting that you mentioned. You mentioned Accenture's 2020 Disability Equality Index report. So those things are going to be included in the resources section in our show notes too. So you can connect with Mike and they get access to all the goodness that he mentioned throughout this podcast interview. Thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was truly my honor.
The Accenture report, Getting to Equal, the Disability Inclusion Advantage, found the companies that offered inclusive working environments for employees with disabilities achieved, on average, a 28% higher revenue, 30% higher economic profit margins, and 2 times net income of their industry peers. I'm linking to this Accenture report in the resources section of our podcast notes over on Workology. And I appreciate Mike sharing his time and expertise today. He is on a mission to change not just an industry, but the business and workplace world. And I love it. And together, we can really make change happen in this area and help drive employment for all, including people with disabilities. This Future of Work series is in partnership with PEAT, and it is one of my favorites. Thank you to PEAT, as well as our Workology podcast sponsor, Workology. Join me for the first ever Virtual HR Expo, October 5th through 9th. Demo and meet 35 companies, just like at the Conference Expo Hall, but all online. Let me and Workology help connect you with great HR technology and service providers at virtualhrexpo.com. That's www.virtualhrexpo.com. .com.